Hi, I'm Sarah Fisher. In this talk, Michela Bariselli and I will present our paper, which is entitled Not Just Words, Balancing Efficiency and Integrity in Translation. The ideas we're exploring here have emerged from conversations that we had during and after our doctoral studies at the University of Reading. And I guess one of the things we're interested in is how meaning gets conveyed through particular forms and uses of language. So our aim in the paper is to just begin drawing some connections between issues that we think arise during translation and a bunch of emerging ideas in the philosophical literature that we think are relevant here. The paper is very much a work in progress, but nevertheless our sense and our hope is that there are some really interesting points of connection to be made here and some scope for cross-fertilization of ideas between philosophy and translation studies. I should say that our own backgrounds are mainly in philosophy and we're less familiar with translation studies, so that's one reason why we're particularly looking forward to getting your feedback during this symposium. The talk is going to be in 3 parts. First, we'll introduce what we've called the linguistic inadequacy problem, and we'll discuss 4 ways in which this problem manifests itself. Then we'll draw a central distinction between communicative efficiency and expressive integrity. And finally, we're going to put these distinctions to work in discussing a handful of translation strategies for dealing with specific instances of the linguistic inadequacy problem.
Let's start by providing some key definition and distinction. Our interest here is to investigate what we call the linguistic inadequacy problem. This problem arises when there is some lack of correspondence between the conceptual hermeneutic resources of the source language from which one is translating and those of the target language into which one is translating. We categorize particular manifestations of these problems as voids or burdens. Both voids and burdens come in simple and complex variety. Discussing some examples will help us explaining this distinction. So, linguistic voids exist when expressions in the target language fail to capture the full meaning of an expression in the source language. Simple voids are determined by a lack of an expression in the target language which leaves unaffected the meaning of other connected expressions. Take, for example, the case of having to translate into English the Italian term trophy, which is a term that indicates a pasta variety. While the English vocabulary does not have a name for this pasta variety, it has other related terms, such as pasta or spaghetti or penne. If the term trophy were to make its way into English, this addition wouldn't affect the meaning of the existing related terms pasta, spaghetti, or penne. In the case of simple voids, the absence of presence of certain expressions leaves unaffected the wider network of meanings. In contrast, complex voids arise when the presence or absence of an expression affects the meaning of other related expressions in the language. As an illustration, take the Tamil kinship terms discussed by Ranganathan, 2019. In Tamil, the same-sex siblings of one's parents are not considered aunts and uncles, but parents. The Tamil language has specific terms to indicate these relationships. For example, one mother's older sister is one periyamma. In English, we would not make such a discrimination and we would call the older sister of one mother one's aunt. So if we were to translate periyamma as aunt, not only we would lose the fineness of grain of the original Tamil term, as in case of simple voids, but it would also be inaccurate. This is because the network of meanings of kinship terms in Tamil seems to have an entirely different structure from the one in English, and the term periyamma displaces altogether any overarching concept of aunt. On the other hand, linguistic burdens exist when expression in the target language introduce extra meaning beyond that of the source language expressions. Simple burdens involve the introduction of additional meaning that does not affect the wider network of meanings. So simple burdens might arise, for example, where expressions acquire additional association in particular languages and cultures, take the case of having to translate stepson or stepdaughter into Italian. If a translator were to use the Italian expression figliastro or figliastra, would add a negative connotation that is not present in the English term. However, the mere presence of this additional connotation need not affect the meanings of other related expressions. The conceptual maps of each language could remain compatible. In contrast, complex burdens exist where the wider networks of meaning in the source and target language are importantly different. Take the case in which one wants to translate the English expression any citizen into Italian. Italian requires to translate this expression using the masculine qualsiasi cittadino, creating a connection between citizen and the male gender, which was not in the original English. The burden becomes complex if one entertains the possibility that gender is non-binary. It is evident that the linguistic requirements of Italian to use feminine or masculine inflections impose constraints on the notion of gender, where English language does not in this case. Translating from English to Italian then may introduce complex burdens which automatically require a connection between the meaning of cittadino, the prominence of the male gender, and the meaning of gender itself, which must be structured in a particularly binary way. While voids and burdens can arise simultaneously, for the purpose of our discussion, it will be useful to hold them apart.
In the next part of the talk, I'll introduce our distinction between communicative efficiency and expressive integrity. Let's start with communicative efficiency. So this concerns how easy it is for the audience to understand the message, or at least some core portion of that message. Put a bit more precisely, a linguistic stimulus is communicatively efficient to the extent that it succeeds in getting across the core meaning, while requiring as little effort as possible from the receiver. To make the idea a bit more concrete, we can think about an example, and this comes from Jhumpa Lahiri's book, In Other Words. So she tells the following story. As we're wandering through the Uffizi, amid galleries that are almost deserted, my sister realizes that she's lost her hat. I open the dictionary. I go to the English-Italian part to find out how to say hat in Italian. In some way, certainly incorrect, I tell a guard that we've lost a hat. Miraculously, he understands what I'm saying, and in a short time, the hat is recovered. So here, Lahiri says that her Italian is certainly incorrect. Nevertheless, she does manage to get across the most important part of the message to the guard, namely that her sister has lost her hat and presumably she'd like to get it back. So we can say that the words were at least efficacious. They get the job done. But probably they could have done it more efficiently. For example, it would have been a little easier for the guard if her Italian had been more fluent. Expressive integrity concerns a language user's freedom to express exactly what they want to in the way they want to. More precisely, a linguistic stimulus has expressive integrity to the extent that it embodies the producer's intended meaning, without omissions or distortions. To get a handle on this, we can think about the particular linguistic choices we make that allow us to get across very subtle nuances. We might even use figurative language, metaphor, and so on. In these cases, we don't just aim to communicate a core message in the simplest way possible. We use language in order to capture in full technicolor and full complexity what we want to express. A couple of quick comments are in order here. First, by labeling this phenomenon expressive, we don't mean to imply that it's no longer communicative. On the contrary, we assume that the language user wants to be understood by the receiver, and this intention to communicate will of course constrain their mode of expression in certain ways. For instance, it would be simply incoherent for me to intend you to understand my utterance, while also expressing myself in a way that I know is incomprehensible. Importantly though, expressive integrity is totally independent of whether or not the audience actually successfully picks up the information being transmitted to them. So even though the speaker aims to get something across, they might fail here. And they might do so, for example, if the audience just doesn't put in the effort that's required for interpretation. But that shouldn't affect the original expressive integrity of the linguistic stimulus. What we want to suggest is that sometimes prioritizing communicative efficiency in translation can end up distorting the meaning of the source material. On the flip side, prioritizing expressive integrity can make the target material harder for the audience to understand. And we're inspired here by Ishani Mitra, who discusses a similar trade-off in the literature on hermeneutical injustice. In the next section of the talk, Michela is going to discuss some specific examples of this tension and how it's balanced by different translation strategies.
We discuss now different strategies for coping with the problem of linguistic inadequacy. Given that we are interested in cases of mismatch between the conceptual maps of the source and the target language, we take inspiration by the philosophical literature that has dealt with related issues. A first strategy is to introduce new expressions. These could be entirely new words or new combination of existing words. Here we draw from the hermeneutical injustice literature, which discusses the coinage of new expression for capturing particular sets of experiences that had been difficult to communicate about. There are versions of this approach, of translation, which prioritize integrity over efficiency. Consider, for example, the case of translating stepson as stepdaughter into Italian by using the English word, and in this way avoiding negative connotation. In a way, this counts as introducing a new term into the Italian text, and this choice would privilege integrity at the risk of confusing the audience and thence losing efficiency. Differently, one could relieve the burden by coining a new term that uses material from the target language so that the new term would ring familiar to the target audience, hence promoting efficiency. For example, stepson and stepdaughter could be translated into configlio or configlia, which uses the neutral term for son and daughter, and add the prefix con to signal equal membership to a group. The coinage of a new but familiar expression privileges efficiency, but in the case of complex burdens and voids, may bring in distortion by suggesting connection between meanings that may be misguided. A second strategy is that of refining or repurposing existing linguistic resources in a target language to do the job of linguistic resources in the source language. We take here inspiration from the conceptual engineering literature, which discusses a similar strategy as part of the ameliorative project. This strategy focuses on how a given term should be understood and used, considering what we want the term to do for us, rather than how it is currently understood and used. This is one way of balancing efficiency and integrity. Communicative efficiency is facilitated by the audience familiarity with existing linguistic resources, and expressive integrity is facilitated by imbuing these resources with a somewhat different meaning, but in line with that of the source material. However, this option comes with problems. The strategies of translation to be efficacious needs either to be a part of a collective effort of amelioration, or the translator must make use of other contextual elements to signal the ameliorative project. For example, a translator could choose to use the term figliastro-figliastra to translate stepson or stepdaughter and use additional contextual elements to signal the need of doing away with the negative connotations. A third strategy would be that of explicitly blocking probable misinterpretations by bringing to light certain differences between the meanings of expression in the source language and the target language. We take here inspiration from Lanton 2018, where she discusses strategies for blocking automatic processes of accommodating unwanted presuppositions. A translator, for example, could choose to eliminate the negative connotation linked with the term figliastro-figliastra by adding a gloss or a footnote, or again could choose to eliminate the gender connotation that would be brought in by translating the English any citizen into Italian by using a periphrasis, for example, a tutte le persone cittadine, to all people who are citizens. This strategy attempts to enhance expressive integrity by seeking to convey more nuance, but it could involve losses in communicative efficiency as it may become harder for the audience to grasp the central message. The fourth and the final strategy we discuss here takes inspiration from Deleuze and Guattari's reflection on minor literatures and minor uses of language. This fourth strategy consists in deterritorializing linguistic resources of a target language by using those resources in radically unfamiliar ways, for example, by subverting standard rules of language. For example, a translator could translate the English expression any citizen by using the Italian feminine inflection rather than the masculine. Or, as has been suggested recently by the linguist Vera Geno, by using the schwa, a letter that belongs to the Italian phonetic alphabet but not to the Italian alphabet. Similar strategies are already in place in the Anglophone world, where the singular they is used to avoid introducing the binary gender connotation. Notice a key difference between this strategy and the first strategy of introducing new expression we discussed earlier. The previous strategy had as a final goal that of integrating the new linguistic material into the existing linguistic material and thence to make it familiar. By contrast, this last strategy deliberately renders the linguistic material jarring so as to call upon the audience's attention. Given the effort required from the audience, this strategy privileges expressive integrity at the risk of losing communicative efficiency.
To conclude then, we started by introducing the linguistic inadequacy problem, a mismatch between the conceptual or hermeneutical resources of two languages, and we discussed how this could manifest as a simple or complex void in the target language, or as a simple or complex burden. In the last part of the talk, we discussed 4 ways of approaching this problem: introducing new expressions, repurposing existing ones, explicitly blocking unwanted meanings, or more radically, deterritorializing language. We tried to begin giving a sense of how each of these strategies balance the dual goals of communicative efficiency and expressive integrity. For example, we saw that it can be quite efficient to use existing words in new ways, or even to combine existing morphemes to make new words. The familiarity of the existing linguistic resources here helps to get the core message across. But there's a danger of distortion if the existing words bring in unwanted meaning, so expressive integrity might be compromised. And this can even have important ethical implications in some circumstances, and the kinds of examples we're most interested in have these dimensions. At the other end of the spectrum, deterritorializing language can help with authentic expression, we suggested, but it might give the audience a lot of work to do just to derive some core meaning. We've tried to give a nuanced picture because we recognize that the appropriateness and the effects of each strategy are highly context dependent. We also recognize that there's more work to do to develop and refine the framework presented here, but we hope to at least have given an indication of some new ways in which bringing together ideas from philosophy and translation studies can lead to mutual enrichment. We have a couple of slides of references. Thank you for listening, and we're looking forward to discussing this with you on Friday the 10th of September at 4:15 CEST.